For those of you that don't know me, I'm Nate Bysack. I'm assistant professor of interior design. Can everybody hear me? I know this mic isn't on. It's just here for the purposes of recording. But so this afternoon, I have the pleasure of introducing Emily Pilloton, who's the second speaker in our Hyde series of speakers in support of the Collaborate Studios. Emily just came from my Learning Spaces studio this afternoon, where she shared some of her insight and expertise. Emily Pilloton is a designer, builder, educator, author, and founder of the nonprofit design agency Project H Design. She uses architecture and design as a vehicle for social justice and public education. She works alongside youth both in and out of schools to bring to life public architecture projects that transform lives and communities. She's particularly invested in using design as a creative voice for young girls and students of color to build change in their own lives. And she's mentored over 200 young girls toward college and careers in STEM-related areas. Her work within public education has catalyzed schools, teachers, leaders, and school districts to reinvent pedagogy around creativity and design, making links back to core subject content. She's built a playhouse with and for daughters of abused mothers, a school library by the hands of its own students, micro homes for a transitional housing community or agency, and a farmer's market with high school students in rural North Carolina. She's currently visiting faculty at UC Berkeley. She's been visiting faculty at UC Davis, and she's the author of 2 books, Design Revolution, 100 Products That Empower People, and Tell Them I Built This, Transforming Schools, Communities, and Lives with Design-Based Education. Her work is documented in the full-length film If You Build It, and has also appeared in the New York Times, CNN, Forbes, Make Magazine, Fast Company, numerous TED stages, my personal favorite, The Colbert Report, and numerous other venues. I've had the pleasure of hearing Emily speak before, and I find her work on social action, designing for empowerment, low-tech, and hands-on built solutions both optimistic and inspiring. And I know that I'm not the only one to refer to listening to Emily speak as hearing a call to action. Please join me in welcoming Emily to the University of Nebraska.
Thank you. Oh. Hello. Am I good? Okay. Can everyone hear me? I feel like this isn't doing anything. I'll talk loud. Okay. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm really excited to be here. And I was in a studio just like half an hour ago, and I'm reminded that we do very important work as designers and architects, and all of you who are at the beginnings of your careers, it's really exciting for me to be in conversation with you because there's so much work to be done. I am not going to talk to you about the election, although I could. Although I will say that in thinking about what I wanted to say to you this afternoon, evening, I'm also thinking about my work in a more political way than I have in the past, and that everything we do is political. And as people who shape the physical world and build structures and spaces that are inhabited by human beings, our work is political. So I'm going to show some of my projects and talk a little bit about some lessons learned in the past 9 years. And then we'll have some time for questions. So I'm going to start at the very beginning. When I was like 8 years old, I grew up in Northern California. I had my first crush on this guy. And I'm realizing that I'm old enough now where some people may not know who this is. So if you don't know MacGyver, this is like a show in the 90s, and he was this like, God, was he a spy? I don't know how he would categorize himself, but he was like chasing down Russians and other horrible people in the mid-90s, and would often get stuck in these situations where he had to get himself out with like a very creative solution. Sometimes that was like a gum wrapper and like making a bomb out of something. But I remember being 8 or 9 years old and thinking, actually more than that, maybe 10 or 11, and thinking like, this is what problem solving looks like. And previously in my school career, as I'm sure many of you feel that your elementary school was maybe not the most inspiring place, this was the first person that I saw, albeit fictitiously, who was solving problems in a creative way, like beyond a math equation. And so I remember thinking this guy's so dreamy and also drives a Jeep Wrangler and lives on a houseboat, but more importantly, that there was like something, there was a different way of solving problems that I hadn't seen before. And you know, at age 9 or 10, I wasn't sure what that meant, but now looking back, I know that this is what would eventually lead me to study architecture. I also had 2 phenomenal grandmothers. My mother is Chinese and my father is French, and so these are my 2 grandmothers, both of whom were incredibly creative and also like not to be messed with. So my grandmother on the left is my Chinese grandmother. She's holding a saw that she played as a musical instrument. Has anyone heard a saw played as a musical instrument? It's very creepy and beautiful. She was a soprano opera singer. She was a champion race walker. She was just like an amazing lady, but also did things in a very unconventional way. My French grandmother was equally creative. She did like really beautiful cross-stitching and stained glass, like all kinds of crafty things. But I remember doing those things with her and her saying, okay, now let's do it a different way. And it would inevitably fail, and then we would try it again. So I did have these women in my life who, again, I didn't know it at the time, but were training me to be a creative, critical thinker. And then I had some fantastic high school teachers. For as much as I think some of us can point to moments in our public education careers and say negative things, I was very lucky to have these teachers who were the first people to give me permission to be a nerd. I loved learning. I still love learning. But there's so much like social baggage as a kid with being the person who's super smart or the nerd. And I remember all 3 of these people telling me it's okay to be a nerd, and it's also okay to be a nerd about everything. You don't have to be like just one thing. You don't have to pick like, I'm gonna be the reader or the math person or the athlete. I was many, many things, and I hadn't considered that I could continue to be all those things. So with their permission to be a nerd about everything, this is when I discovered architecture and building. So I'm 15 years old in this picture, and I raised about $3,000 for myself, like selling random things, garage sales, cookies, begging my family friends for money, and I went down to Belize for the summer between my sophomore and junior years of high school, and I built this gazebo type thing with a group of students from all around the country. So there are many trips like this, these like travel community group trips. And so I went there specifically because I wanted to learn how to build, and I did. I mean, I learned how to build one thing, a gazebo, but this was like the Venn diagram of all these things I felt like a nerd about. I was like, oh, architecture is the place that will allow me to continue to be all those things. I could be interested in human beings, I could read about history, I could learn about materials and science, I could use all the math that I had learned. It just felt like this is the place I wanted to be. So fast forward about 16 years, and I went to school and studied architecture. I went to UC Berkeley. I went to the School of the Art Institute in Chicago and got a master's. And then I graduated with $80,000 in debt, which I'm sure many of you can empathize with. So I'm 24 years old and have $80,000 in debt, and I have parents that are saying, go get a job and make sure you have a 401k and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All those adult things that you're supposed to do. So I did that. And I worked for a handful of years in architecture, in design, being an adult. And I found that to be very boring and disappointing. So I left a traditional architectural career in 2008, and I started Project H. And I should say right now, I was 26 when I started Project H. I had $1,000 in my bank account. I had quit a job that had a very good salary and like all the things that were on that list. And I quit because I didn't find that work fulfilling or interesting or challenging in any way, none. And so I started this organization to purely as like a shell under which I would have to figure out how to do that, how to do work that was meaningful, that felt connected to human beings, that felt like it was solving problems in that MacGyver-y kind of way. I wanted to figure out how to do that. And that meant for me that I was going to set up a nonprofit, not knowing how to run a business, and figure it out. So since then, in the past, our 9th birthday is on January 8th, this coming January. So we're almost 9 years old. And I've been figuring it out ever since. And I think I will continue to try to figure out how to do that kind of work. So I have 4 projects I want to show. Each have like a little lesson that, of course, you don't know as you're doing it, but in hindsight, I can say, oh, that's the thing I learned. So I want to share those with you. And this is a hypothesis of mine, but I definitely think that those of you who are in architecture or design school right now are, well, you should count yourselves lucky, because I feel like these conversations about social impact, about social justice, about humanitarian design, about sustainability are much more naturally embedded in the work that you're doing. And I went to architecture school from 1999 to 2003, and this was not a part of the conversation. So I think that it is now, and it should be more. And I'll show you these projects, and I want to encourage you to think about the work that you're doing and what pieces of this resonate with you and how you want to carry forward your own social charge. So the first, the first project or story I want to share with you, some of you may have seen this project before. So in 2009, I was invited to come to North Carolina, rural North Carolina, and by a school district. And so I'm living in the Bay Area at the time, in San Francisco, which is the opposite of rural North Carolina. So I'm living in San Francisco. I get this email from this guy who is a superintendent of the school district in middle of nowhere, eastern North Carolina. And he says, oh, hi, I saw your work in Dwell magazine. Can you come down here and help me fix this school district that is about to be taken over by the state because it's such a disaster? And I thought it was spam for a minute. I'm like, who is this? Like, what kind of superintendent reads Dwell magazine? And then thinks to email me that I have something to offer to the school district. Like, it just did not compute. But I was like, sure, let's do that. Let's go down there. So I went to Bertie County, North Carolina, and like quickly discovered that this guy was kind of a renegade. He wanted to do things differently, and he wanted to not repeat the errors of the past, which is why he emailed to architect designer people. So I ended up working with him. His name was Dr. Chip Zollinger. I ended up working with him for 2 years on like a bunch of different projects. We redid their computer labs. We designed and built out a really cool weight room for their football team because there's nothing to do there ever except for on Friday nights when there's a football game. And so we thought, let's invest in that as like an actual source of community. We did a graphic campaign for the whole school district. We built 4 playgrounds for their elementary schools. So we were working on projects with him. And then we realized, when I say we, I mean me and my former partner, Matt Miller. We realized like this feels very disingenuous. We keep flying down here from San Francisco and building something and then leaving. And how does that fundamentally transform a school district? And so we said to Dr. Zollinger, we actually want to teach. We want to become teachers and teach a high school class and teach design and construction and build things that the community needs. And so I like pitched this to him thinking he would say, oh, well, you know, there's like these hurdles and you can't, and you're not certified and whatever. And he said, okay, sure, great. Be here in August. So that's how I became a high school teacher. So I did that. Matt and I moved to North Carolina. This is May of 2010, so over 6 years ago now. And we had 13 students, our very first year of teaching, who were forced to be in our class by their school. They had these different tracks of learning, and this was one particular track, and they were just like put in our class. And they showed up on the first day and looked around. We had built out this barn as like a studio and a shop, and they looked around and were like, where are we? What is going on? It didn't feel like their normal classroom. I should also say that most of them were only taking other classes online, so we were the only human being teachers that they had all day. They were taking PE online. Yeah, think about that one for a minute. So I have these 13 junior year students, and I have pledged to myself and to Dr. Zollinger and to the school community that we're going to teach design and building, and we're going to build a piece of architecture for this town of 1,800 people. And I have 13 teenagers staring at me like, who are you and where are you from? And what are we doing? So I asked them to design a chicken coop. And my goal, beyond anything else, was I needed for them to trust me, and I needed for them to trust that their ideas were safe with me and that I could help them make those ideas a reality. So I asked them to design chicken coops, and as you might guess, the first sketches that I got were a box with a triangle on top. Like anytime you tell someone to draw a house or any kind of structure, that's what they'll draw, a square with a triangle. And I said, okay, now you can't do that. Now you have to design a chicken coop that's inspired by the verb to fold. And that's that one right there. Or you have to design a chicken coop that only uses arcs of a circle. All of these creative constraints. So then the work became interesting. And one of my students brought me a model, a second version of this model on the lower right, and said, okay, this is the coop I want to build. I've built 10 versions of this model, let's go build it. And in my head, I'm thinking, this is so beautiful, and I have absolutely no idea how to build this. And so this was like my first lesson that I had put myself in this highly uncomfortable, unpredictable situation, and I now had a choice whether to tell my student, I don't know how to build this, or to like play teacher and say like, okay, yeah, great, let's do it, and then like secretly figure out how to do it. So I chose in that moment to like be vulnerable and honest, and I told him, I was like, Eric, I don't know how to build this, but I promise you, you have my word, I swear on my right arm that we'll figure out how to build this thing together. So that was how the trust started to happen. And we did figure it out. We prototyped this crazy sheet metal, like sandwiched hinge that allowed this coop structure to be both flexible and also rigid and unified at the same time. It was like this big folding ribbon. And then I taught an introduction to MIG welding so that we could build a structural frame to hold up the roof. They use a rubberized paint to weatherize it. And then this was the final coop, which they named Coopus Maximus. I don't know why. And then you can see the one in the background also, that we did 3 total coops. The one in the background was inspired by the verb to twist. It was like this really cool like DNA structure with 2 cubes on the side. Here's the team that built it. So again, like this is not some transformative project, but it was the first thing that allowed me to have a trusting relationship with my students and have them actually believe that even though they were taking PE online and had no other teachers, that there was someone in their school community that cared about them and who cared about their ideas and who really wanted to help change the way that they learned and hopefully change the face of their community in the process. So that was the next challenge. Okay, so now we've built chicken architecture, and now let's talk about people architecture. We have promised to the town and to many people that this class exists for some kind of social or economic impact. So we go and do a bunch of interviews. We talk to like 1 billion people and ask farmers and families and business owners and the mayor, and we go to the Rotary Club meetings and we ask everyone, what do we want for this community? And many people said we need a farmer's market. And being from California, I'm like, well, that's boring. There's farmers markets everywhere. Who needs another? Okay, but in rural North Carolina, that's like a really big deal. The closest farmers market was 90 miles away. You have very high obesity rates. You have almost no public health budget allocated by the county. And yet you have this farming legacy. This is an agricultural economy. So you have the infrastructure and the need. But it just doesn't exist. So we decide, okay, we're going to build a farmer's market. And the mayor allocated this plot of land, which was so generous, that was like right as you came into town. We went to the state farmer's market. We asked ourselves, what do we want our farmer's market to look like? What do we want it to not look like? That's my favorite question. Sometimes when you don't know how to answer the question, like, what do you want? It's much easier to ask, like, what's the worst thing? What's the thing you don't want? We did a ton of sketches. We presented our work to the public. We put stuff up in this empty building downtown and asked people to come and look at it and just tell us, what do you think? What do you think about this idea for a farmer's market? This is one of the town council members talking to my student, Karan, and I love this photo for so many reasons, but primarily because these are two people that I can guarantee would never have met in this county if it had not been for this project. There was no reason that their paths ever would have crossed. And so the idea that architecture and kids and an educational program could do that was incredibly powerful. I took this as like a snapshot. I didn't even look at it. And then flipping through photos like 2 or 3 months later, I was like, oh, that's why. Like, that is why this work matters. We had a critique. This should feel familiar. This is what we ended up with. This is a really, really simple design. We had $60,000 from a grant. We had 3 months over the summer to build this, and we had a construction crew of teenagers who are all under the age of 18 and therefore cannot operate a power tool on a construction site. So these are my constraints. Oh, it's also a hurricane zone and a flood zone. So in my architectural education, this is where the project stops. Like, you put this thing on the table and people come in and critique it and maybe make you cry or maybe not, but then you're done. Like, that's it. And for us, this was like the 50-yard line. Not even. This was like the 30-yard line. So now we have to go and build this thing. So everyone gets out of school. It's like June 15th. People are like getting on their jet skis, and my students are digging holes. And we dug holes for the foundation footers for what felt like forever. I threw my back out twice. We assembled the structural trusses for the building on site by hand because no power tools. Actually, that's not true. I had one kid that turned 18 on like July 3rd. So like halfway through the summer, I had a chop saw guy. One of our neighbors dropped off this giant piece of machinery and said, have fun. And we learned how to use it, and we lifted the trusses into the air. This is my favorite moment of any project. And if any of you have the opportunity to build the thing that you design, this is like the money moment where you realize this thing that was a model on your desk, like however long ago, is now physically in the world. It's like it has been birthed. And to watch, so I'm watching this thinking that, and then I'm looking at my students with like these big googly eyes, like, oh my God, this was a class project, and now it's real. It was like the most transformative moment for everyone involved. I should also say that we didn't just have to build a farmer's market, we had to start a farmer's market, like an actual enterprise that people would come to and know about. And so as this was happening, this was on a Saturday, this is like July 8th, it was like the middle of the summer. And so as we were building it, we started a temporary farmer's market so that people could get in the habit of coming out on Saturdays. So adjacent to our job site, there's all these card tables set up with people selling their stuff. So on Saturday, this was on a Saturday, we're doing this and people are walking up to the temporary farmer's market and looking at this job site with like me behind the wheel of this thing and 16-year-olds who are male, female, black, white, and it's like quite the sight. Like people were like, what is going on? And I loved that. That was what I wanted. I think that having that kind of spectacle that shakes people from their reality, where they're asking questions about what's happening in their town, who are the authors of physical space, was so important. So even though that was like a passive engagement, they're just walking to the temporary farmers market, they were a part of it. There was a theater and a participation and a questioning. Okay, so then we're like back to Carpentry 101. At this point, we're all so tired. I'd lost like 10 pounds. It was, yeah, but the craft and the precision that was required to build this structure was like a really high standard. And so my students who had taken it this far were like really committed to, if I asked you for a joist at 95 and 5/8, don't bring it to me at 95 and 3/4 because that just cost us $21 and now you have to redo it. So this was like all in, everyone was really focused. We put up the siding on the what would become this like billboard surface for the town. And then this is the final structure. So we opened the farmer's market at the end of the summer, and I think about eight or 10 vendors showed up on the first day. This is 6 years ago, so there are now over 50 vendors. The farmers market is responsible for creating 4 new businesses. Like, people who were selling there now have actual businesses and brick and mortar stores downtown, and 15 full-time jobs, which is 3 times as many as when Domino's came to town, which was a huge deal. It was like front page news. But so aside from all the economic numbers that I can point to, so these are most of my students who worked on this project, and they're standing in it. Like, just like take a minute to think about that. You're a junior in high school. You did this class project that you're now standing in. And this was at the opening ceremony, and the mayor was there, and he gave my students the key to the city, like a physical key. And then my student Karan, who's the same one you saw before, he's in the striped shirt, he took the microphone from the mayor and he said, I'm going to come back here someday with my kids and I'm going to tell them that I built this. And I was like, that is all I ever needed to hear. That is the kind of work I want to do. This is the type of learning that kids deserve, and this is the type of work that communities deserve to be a part of as a collective group. So this was like proof of concept that I felt like there was something that I had begun that did matter, and there was a way to do this work that didn't feel like it had previously for me. In the year that followed, my next class of students I was like, what do you want to build? I really wanted to build an animal shelter. No one was into that. I don't know why. But they were like, no, we want to build another farmer's market. And I was like, I'm kind of done with farmer's markets for now. But they said, no, it's a really big county and we want it to feel more networked. Like, if you don't live in Windsor, you might live 45 minutes away from the farmer's market. So can we have this like system of smaller pop-up farmers markets? So we ended up building these little 100 square foot pop-up satellite markets. This is one, and this is the other. I turned this into battle of the sexes. One of these was designed by the female students and one was designed by the male students. Does anyone want to guess which one? Male or female? Female? This was the men. This was the boy students. I was like, that looks very voluptuous. What's on your mind? So the girls was like super rational and everything's a right angle and it was like all mathematical, and then the boys was, anyway, they're both gorgeous, but that was like a little bit of a social experiment on my part. So just to go back to the original slide I had up before, when I did not know what Project H was going to be. I do think that there are invitations that you will get or spaces that you will be asked to participate in that will feel like so uncomfortable and jarring and like that doesn't feel like something I can do. And I think that those are the things that you should be doing. So when I moved to North Carolina and when I pitched to Dr. Zollinger, we want to teach high school and build architecture with 16-year-olds, even as I was saying it, I was like, this is crazy, like red alert. But that is the kind of work that matters, and that's the kind of work that makes you a better designer and a better architect, and it's the type of work that makes a difference in the community. So I encourage you to follow like anything that feels that uncomfortable and horrifying, like please do it. I think that those are the things that make us all better. So secondly, and I think this was also a lesson I learned in North Carolina, that often I get asked the question about scale, like how are you going to do your work in more places and bigger and more cities or whatever, and I always say I'm not going to do that. I'm going to be in one place and I'm going to know all of my students, and that is what makes the work good. So I also think that as architects or designers, we are trained and educated to respond to a context, and that should apply to people as well. So this idea of intimacy, that the community, the faces, the people, the traumas, the fears of the community is incredibly important. And so I won't go into like a whole soap opera, but after 2 years, we left North Carolina. For a number of political and financial reasons. Dr. Zollinger was not there anymore. We left certain parts of the program, but anyway, we could save that part for Q&A. And I brought the program back to the Bay Area. There was a school that had just gotten started. It was a charter school called Realm Charter School. And this was a school where the charter was specifically focused on project-based learning and social justice. And they said that they wanted a program that would embody those things in a really audacious way. And I was like, I'll do it. So we brought the program to Realm Charter School, and I asked the same question I asked of my North Carolina students. What do you want to build for your community? So this is what I mean about context. These students, while they're all 16 and they're all teenagers and they're like kind of dealing with the same stuff, the context is very, very different. So I have students in Oakland and Richmond who are living in the worst housing conditions. I have students who are homeless. I have students who are living with 4 generations of a recent immigrant family in a 1-bedroom apartment. And so when I asked them, what do you want to build? The first topic that came up was housing and how we live in this very dense urban area, again, like the opposite of rural North Carolina, where public housing and affordable housing is at the top of everyone's mind, especially for recent immigrant families, for parts of East Oakland that are being either gentrified or are completely invisible to many of the local political leaders. And so that was our charge for the year. I asked my students, well, how do we respond to that? How do we all think about what housing means, which is a very personal thing, but it's also political and economic and social. So what do we do? So sort of serendipitously, we came in contact with this group called Opportunity Village, which is a transitional housing organization for homeless individuals. It's a 6 to 9 month time period when you can live on their premises, and you're part of this job training program. It's a pretty robust program. It's phenomenal. And their entire facility is made up of these tiny homes. So I'm sure people have seen like the super decked out, tricked out tiny homes. There's also a lot of people that are thinking about how tiny homes can work as emergency or homeless housing solutions. So we said, what if let's build 2 micro homes, and let's donate one and let's sell the other so we can continue to do this work in future years. So what was interesting about Opportunity Village is that all of the plots were about the same, but then people would like really personalize and turn their house into something that felt like their own, even though they were only living there for 6 months. It was like during that time period, that was their home, and they made it their own. And so we took this idea of like home being both personal and universal. The idea of home is universal, but the home itself is very personal. And we started making models. We did models of our own homes. We did models of each other's homes. This is like one of 5 tables full of models. It turns out that like architecture students love making models, but like sophomores in high school don't like it when you say, oh, that's really beautiful, go make 50 more. They're like, what? Give me my grade. So this is also like a big sort of cultural shift in the classroom that you're never done. There's always one more model. So we made many, many models. We asked students to talk about their work, not just what the model was, but why it was personal to them. And many of them had like very personal stories about why their home was the way it was and how that inspired the way they thought about these 2 micro homes. And then we had to build the thing. I'll show the final design in a minute, but I had 85 students in 4 class periods, which means I have a construction crew for 65 minutes, and then I have another construction crew for 65 minutes, and then another one and another one. Like the worst possible workflow for a construction project. But it meant that it was also a challenge for my students to think about as a process, how do you build something with 85 other teammates and not lose efficiency and precision? So we did these framing plans to put up the walls so that anyone could pick up any step of the process, no matter what class or day of the week or whatever. This is that same moment as when the trusses went into the air for the farmer's market. This is like the, oh my God, it's real moment. And then, so this is what I love about young people. They will always force you to re-examine your own life and ideas. So I hate pallet wood like more than anything. I used to make furniture out of pallet wood. It's, have any of you tried to take apart a pallet? It's very hard, and like I probably have tetanus. It's just, so, but of course my students were like, we want the siding to be pallet wood, and we found someone that will donate it, and I was like, please no pallets. And they were adamant. They really wanted pallet wood siding, and I said, okay, fine. I'm not touching it, but go for it. And so they spent, I've never seen such dedication. For like probably 2 weeks, they took apart pallets and like painstakingly, like about 200 of them, and it took them all apart, planed and cut and stained them, and then this is the siding that they ended up with. So this is one of the 2 homes. The interior is really, really simple. Because it was going to this shared housing area, we actually were not allowed to put in plumbing or a kitchen because those are shared services. So this is just sort of like an open living space with some storage, and it is wired for electricity, but we also designed it to be naturally lit. These are the students that built it. So they're like little Siamese twins, like one is here and one is there. And this is the woman who's living in it currently. I love this project so much because I can trace certain details of this to specific students, and those students and their stories like really do live in like the little moments of these houses. One of my students said that he was living with his grandmother, his great-grandmother, and his mother, and his many siblings in this tiny home, tiny little house, and that it was one room and there was one window, and it was like this big. And he's describing it to me, and I'm like, oh my God, this sounds horrible. And so when we are having this discussion about how you create a space that's private and feels protected, but not also like a jail cell, like how you strike that balance. So that's where this window design came from, is that we wanted to have a place that felt like a nest, but that also felt airy and light. So we did this window strip across the top, and the rest is fairly enclosed. So again, the idea of housing seems very big. It seems like a big social charge. But to me, what is special about this project is that it started with the things that are so small and intimate about my students' lives, and that those things actually do transcend, become universal. But if we start from a place of knowing our students, our community, our clients, that those are the things that then grow into the most special moments of our work. Okay, thirdly, so I believe deeply in intimacy. I believe deeply in going to places where you feel uncomfortable. And I also, obviously, as an architect, believe in the power of physical space. Like, I mean that literally, like making 4 walls that things happen within. And what happens within those walls says something about what we want our world to look like. I also think that historically, and I would say even now, there is a pretty small sliver of the population that actually has a say in what spaces are made. So I want to also do work and think about who are the authors of our physical environments, and how do we change that so that there are more voices in those spaces. So 3 years ago, I was asked by this charter school, which is a high school and a middle school. A lot of the middle school parents said, well, your program's at the high school, how come it's not at the middle school? And I was like, maybe because 13-year-olds with power tools are terrifying, and I don't want to even go near that. But I somehow got talked into it. So I ended up teaching, we taught an 8th grade class of 108 8th graders in a tiny little room with a lot of power tools. It was terrifying. 8th graders are also just terrifying in general. They're like not really human yet, but they think they are. Anyway, so I ended up with this class of 8th graders, and same question. I'm like, what do we want to build for our community? And almost across the board, there was a resounding, we want a library. We don't have a library. And I was like, why don't we have a library? Because the school had this room that was allocated to be a library, and then they ran out of their construction budget before they could build it out and fill it with books. So I said, okay, fine, let's build the library. Again, in my head, I'm like, don't know how we're going to do this, but we're going to figure it out. That's like if I had something tattooed on my shoulder, it should be that. Like, don't know, we'll figure it out. So I took all of my 8th graders to the local public library, and this student population is so interesting and like complex and diverse. So there's a high special education rate, and there's also a significant population of students who have had moderate to severe disciplinary problems at other schools. So this is Timmy and Tenzin. Tenzin is autistic. He is brilliant and artistic and has social limitations. And Timmy is like adorable and hilarious and a big troublemaker. And so they're sitting at a table together, and I'm asking them the same thing. Let's go to the library and let's draw sketches of what we want our library to look like. So this is where like design is a great equalizer. Like that question is meaningful to both of these students, and it doesn't actually matter if one of them is autistic and one of them is a troublemaker. Like that question still resonates with both of them. So we went to the public library, and the consensus was that they wanted it to look like the opposite of this. And I was like, wow, what's wrong with this library? It's so great. They said, well, it's not interesting because you go there and you say, I'm looking for To Kill a Mockingbird, and the librarian says, oh, here's your Dewey Decimal thing, and you go and you get it and you check it out and you go home. And they said to me, we want a library that doesn't feel like a place of reference. They wanted it to be this place that was about exploration and discovery, rather than just like book, 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 book. So, okay, great. Like, how do we do that? What does that mean spatially? So we made these little tiny, little prototype models thinking about what does that mean in terms of book storage, because we're still talking about books. There's a unit that needs housed. What does that mean in terms of space planning? Like we had this weird long space. How do you think about that? Is there a private zone? Is there a public zone? Is there some like weird flow between them? What does that look like? How do you move through it? And then we started making a building block. This was like a great aha moment. One of the 8th graders said, Miss Emily, there's 108 of us. How are we going to build one library that everyone feels like is their library? And I was like, I have no idea. I have no idea. So what they suggested is, okay, let's not design the whole library. Let's design a building block, like a fancier version of a Lego, that we could put together in many, many permutations and combinations so we can make lots of different things and have that be a continuous process. And I was like, you 13-year-olds are geniuses. That's so smart. So what they came up with was this. This is like a simple, it's 2 pieces of wood that interlock together like that. Well, at the beginning it was supposed to be, they were supposed to be like orthogonal, like vertical and horizontal pieces that would lock together. But then when we sat it on the table, and it was an X instead of a plus, and now everything's on a 45-degree angle, we looked at it and said, that's actually a lot more interesting. That's a much more interesting shelf. It forces you to turn your head. It forces you to have to interact. It's also, this is another brilliant 13-year-old moment. They said, well, it's also the thing we're learning in algebra, which is the unknown. And so like, this is the place you go to find the thing that you don't know. Let's call it the X space. I was like, brilliant, that's so smart. So we started referring to the library as the X space. We made about 400 of these X's. We started putting them together. You can make a shelf. You can make a shelf/bench. You can make a table, this like double-sided table thing. You can fill an entire wall with them. We put them in the room itself, and we invited the 6th and 7th graders to just come in and have a reading marathon, just to experience the space as a place of reading for the very first time. We set up a student exhibition where you could just come and put your zines or whatever it was that you were working on and exhibit your work as an 8th grader. And in the process of doing these little test builds, we realized like, this is the library. There is no finished library. The beauty of this thing is that it's constantly editable, and that was the best way to create a space that was about discovery, is to not actually script it as some fixed thing. So this is what the library looks like now, but when I go in there sometimes there's like an entire shelf missing. I'm like, what happened to that section? And some students like, oh, we moved it down the hall. It's in so-and-so's class. Or there's like a brand new shelf like filled with comic books. I'm like, where'd that come from? So this space is not finished, and I think that's what makes it great. This is what makes me very anxious, because as the architect person, I want like the finished thing, like show me the picture, like give me the thing. But it's not. It's like always changing. And that's exactly what my students wanted. So it is a place of discovery. It's a place where you can go in this week and you can go in 3 weeks later and it might look totally different. And that's what makes it engaging for a 13-year-old. So even though I want it to be more fixed, this is like a highly successful project for the people that made it. And it's a physical space. It's like a physical space where now 6th, 7th, and 8th graders go in, they feel like it's theirs, and they interact with it, and they know that they have a creative voice to continue to shape it. Okay, and then, so my last thing, which I think is probably what I'm thinking about most in the past few days, I don't even know how to start this. How irreverent do I want to be right now? So for the record, I don't care about how anyone voted in this room. I don't think that's the point. I think that there are things that we do as creative people that are audacious and brave and great, and I think there are a lot of things that we don't do enough. So we're in the fine art building, right? Yeah. Okay. I was thinking about this in terms of the fine artists that I know, or the conceptual artists, people who identify themselves as artists. And oftentimes artists will start explaining their work with something very personal. They'll say, like, when I was a kid, my father was an alcoholic, or I grew up in whatever, or my mother was a whatever. Like, many artists I know start with something that is personal and or political or revolutionary. That's the impetus for their work. I don't think that we do that as much as designers or architects. We have the program and the site, and like that's what we respond to. And so I've been thinking more and more that that's actually not enough, that we should be bringing our stories and our politics and our own revolutions to our work. That like this is the place to do that. So for me, going back to my MacGyver days, you know, I'm a mixed race person, woman. I grew up in an all-white town, and I'm not telling you that because I have some victim story. I think that that just shaped the way I think about my identity as something that was different. And also, being a nerd and wanting to build stuff at a very young age, I often found myself as the only girl in many rooms. So I don't know that I have a chip on my shoulder about that. I'm just saying that because I think that it would be ignorant and wrong for me to not acknowledge that that has been a part of my identity and of my career. So all that to say that in the course of teaching my high school and middle school programs, and I think starting with the Battle of the Sexes, farm stands was the first time I thought about it, that my female students were behaving differently in a co-ed space than they were when I would pull a group of them out. I would have these phenomenally brilliant female students who in a co-ed space, when I said someone go run the chop saw, none of them would volunteer, and that really bothered me. So this started as an experiment, and also, you know, remembering what it felt like to be in an all-male space when I was a kid. So I created this program called Girls Garage, which is just for girls. They're it started as 9 to 12, and now there are girls that are about to age out, so I keep extending the age group, so now it's up to 16. So I have 9 to 16-year-olds, and we build stuff together, and we learn how to weld, and we build things for nonprofit partners, and we do that as a family. And it is, without question, the most rewarding part of my work. So this is Fiona and Amber. Amber, who's on the left, when I met her, she was living with her mother in a homeless women's shelter for women who were either homeless or were leaving situations of domestic abuse. And she's standing in a playhouse that she built for that women's shelter, for herself and for other kids. And she's 8 years old in this picture. I let her in early. She was like 2 months before her 9th birthday. But I think about this as not only like, oh, okay, girls, let's build some stuff, but like an actual rigorous pathway to understanding your own power and like doing that through physical work. So we started with really basic Woodshop skills. We run all kinds of saws. We start with this like very simple, kind of like low risk project, design a birdhouse. The rules are you can only put things together at a right angle. These are all the birdhouses. Some of them clearly broke the 90-degree rule, but I knew that was going to happen. These are all their birdhouses. Okay, so now we can operate all these saws. Let's fuse metal now. The look on a 10-year-old girl's face after she welds for the first time is like about the best thing on the planet. There's like something superhuman about it, and it completely changes the way you think about what you're capable of. I had the same experience when I didn't learn how to weld until I was 22, but that's how I felt. So we've built a birdhouse, we know how to weld, and then I ask my girls to consider how to use a tool like a welder, which is like pretty badass for a 10-year-old, how to use a tool like that to make something that's personally meaningful. So I give them this challenge every year to design a steel symbol out of 4 pieces of steel that represents the meaning of their family name. And many of them don't know the meaning of their family name, so they have to like call their mom or like Google it or whatever. But they have this constraint. You get 4 pieces of steel, that's it. Not 3, not 5. And then they come up with their design, and this is Erica's. And that's meaningful to them. They've done this really technical, hardcore thing, but in a highly personal way. And then I ask them, so every step I'm like taking them up a notch in rigor and in fidelity. So then I ask them, now what can you build together? You just built this thing that means something to you, like now what can you build together? So Erica, who you just saw, she's now about to learn how to drive. It's crazy. She's 9 and 10 in this photo. She's the second to the right. She's like one of my best welder girls. And I said to her, this is like on a day of camp when everyone was done early, and I said, okay, Erica, you're in charge. Go take these girls and figure out something that you can build together. And that's all I said. And it's hard to see. This angle's a little tricky, but it says fearless. This is all just like flat stock steel. And they made this sign that says fearless. So, okay, we can make stuff together now, things that mean something to us collectively. What about things that mean something to people beyond ourselves? Like, how do you think about using tools with meaning made by us as a group for some kind of purpose beyond our walls? So these are pieces of furniture that were built for the women's center, the women's shelter. You may recognize the shelves. They were leftovers from the library. We redid their entire garden as an edible garden. We did a concrete coffee table, concrete top. And then this is the playhouse I mentioned before. So these were all pieces that were made for the women's center. And then sometimes we'd make stuff like just because we want to. So often I'll say at the end of camp, like, now you know how to use everything in this wood shop, in this metal shop, like go make the thing that you've just been wanting to make. And so there's like a cat house. That suitcase is like a Lego organizer. There's a coat rack. There's little mini libraries, garden tool organizer. So coming together as a group should also just be a space where we feel safe to make the things that we want to, because we can, and why can't we? This is the physical space. Again, back to the idea of like making space for unheard voices. This is the only makerspace only for girls, like the only girls makerspace that I know of. I've like tried to do really robust research. I can't find another one in the country. There's 2 women's only makerspaces, but they're for adults only. So as far as I know, this is the only makerspace just for girls in the country. Someone finds another one, like let me know, because I want to talk to them. But I do think it's really important to have spaces that are owned by a group of people who come together with a purpose to talk about what it means to occupy that space. And then I took this photo last night. This is like, we just finished our fall after school program, and these are like our newest group of 9-year-olds. They just started. And they made, so these are like their little robots. They made wooden spoons. They learned how to chisel. This is all hand tools, so we start them with hand tools and then move up. But anyway, I took this last night, and then I was feeling pretty disoriented and bummed the entire week, and I just was like staring at this photo and thinking, this is really important work. It's important because it is my story, but it's more important because it's now their story. And given what's happening in the world, again, regardless of your politics, I feel so strongly more than ever that whatever it is that we do, we have to be willing to do it in a political and vocal way. And then just as importantly, we have to be willing to listen to the other side. So this is not just about like training some band of feminists, although that's part of it, but also asking them, like, why are we an all-girls space? Like, what does it feel like to be the only girl? What does it feel like if you're in a group of girls and there's one boy? Like, how would you treat that boy? So I think about my work much more politically now, and I think that at the start of your careers, this is like an amazing moment to be engaged in something that matters, like really on either side, and to try to seek out spaces that make you uncomfortable with people you disagree with, to make spaces that are your own, and to continue to like push what you believe to be comfortable. And I mean, like, I don't know why, like the girl on the right, that's like a I'm gonna kill you, but I like believe anything is possible face, and like I want my work to always feel like that. So that's it. Thank you. I think we have time for questions. I don't know if, we're not doing the microphone? No.
Yeah, if you just
I'll repeat it.
summarize.
Okay.
Yeah.
Questions? So the question was, would I ever consider doing our work or this project in Nebraska, specifically here on campus? I had a conversation with someone before about this question of like, where do we want to be in other places, and what does it mean to scale and have like franchises? And so my answer is no, and also definitely yes. And I mean, like, no, I don't want to do it myself, but I will seriously hand you my hard drive, and like I have zero proprietary anything over my work, and I think that it should exist other places, but I also want to know that there are other people who will like commit to the place and the work in the way that I have in the place that they live. So no and yes. Like, I think that there are people who should and who I would love to work with to make that happen. Yeah. And I don't know that's the thing, I don't know what that looks like here. I don't know enough about this school or this town, but I want to learn, and I would love to meet the people who would want to put in the work to do it. So the question was what I learned from being in a more traditional practice at the beginning, and if I could go back to being in a traditional practice.
Yeah, like what would you do differently?
What would I do differently? Yeah, you know, it's funny, like I think that now when you all graduate, there are many more opportunities to do work that is non-traditional. But I think it's, if you end up in a firm where you're like designing plumbing fixtures, like do it, like kill it, you know? I think that I actually owe a lot to those years because I learned so many skills. I mean specific skills. Like, I didn't learn AutoCAD in any of my education. At the time, UC Berkeley would not accept digital drawings. So I didn't learn AutoCAD until I was out in the world and had a job. So there's like skills that I learned. I think also I had to learn how to work within an office culture and a architectural firm culture where every day I was like, I disagree with these people so vehemently, and yet I have to do the work. And I think that later, when you do this type of more social work, that still happens in different ways. You're sitting across from someone where you're like, I cannot even fathom your life ethos, and yet somehow we have to make this project work. So I think it teaches you how to be diplomatic, how to still be productive, even when you're like sitting across from someone you want to strangle. And then also just like how to do all those adult professional things. Like, this is such a bad example, but I didn't know what BCCing was on an email until I got an email from my boss to a client who blind copied me, and I replied to the client, and she was like, don't ever do that again. So I'm like, why? I didn't even know what that was. So stupid little things, but you don't understand the full consequences of like those professional habits until you're out in the world. Things like budgeting, I mean, like all of those things that I had to learn how to do to run a nonprofit, I can sort of trace back to being in a more traditional firm. So I don't know. I don't know that I would have, if I could go back, I can think of a number of jobs I shouldn't have taken. But I actually am really grateful for those years. I don't know, maybe I would have been in the same exact place as I am now if I hadn't. But I think it's good to be in spaces where you are in a constant state of protest, because then when you leave them, you're like, okay, I have my fire. So maybe I wouldn't have been as pissed off if I hadn't done that type of work, yeah. Let's go all the way in the back. Yeah, so that's the questions about the H's and the Project H, specifically happiness. When I first wrote, I was trying to come up with a name for my organization, and I was like scribbling a bunch of stuff, and literally I wrote like all these words in this mind map, and I was like, oh, a lot of them start with H. There's my name. So I called it Project H, and I said I would think of something better later, and I never did. But happiness was actually not on that list. When I showed the list of my H words to my mother, she was like, you should include happiness. And I was like, what? Like, that's, like, no, this is not fluffy. Like, that I'm not going to include. And she's like, no, that's important. So I did. Yeah, I think another H that's missing is hard. Like, this is really hard work. So I think I have been happy in my career. I've been very lucky because I get to do the work that I want to do. That is like priceless. I don't have to listen to anyone. I can do the work I want to do. Well, of course I have to listen to people, especially my students, but you get it. I think that brings me great happiness. I think that the projects we do often bring happiness to kids and communities, but it's really, really, really hard. Maybe that's why it brings us happiness, because we know that it's incredibly hard, and then when we come out the other end, we can point to it and say we did it. So yeah, I think that's certainly, I try to hold that H in the back of my mind always, because there's times when it's not fun and it's really hard, but in the end it always ends up being something that I hope brings a lot of like joy and happiness to people. Yeah, the questions about curriculum, secondary schools, and it being adopted by others. This is similar to this question. So I have written it as a curriculum. It's like a thing. I could hand it to you. I think the problem with that, I was saying this again earlier to someone, that like at the heart of architecture is the response to a context. And so I can give you that thing and say, follow this from steps 1 to 100, but I don't know that it works in every context. I think the reason why our program works is because we're able to make space for students who say, I'm homeless, or I live in a 1-bedroom apartment with 4 generations of my family, and then that becomes the curriculum. So there are a number of schools who we've worked with directly, who've said we want our version of this program, and we help them to develop it. But I don't really believe in the like drag and drop. I think that misses a huge opportunity to create something that is like hyper meaningful in that particular place. I got an email a couple years ago from a teacher in Brooklyn who said, can you send me the plans for your farmer's market? Because I want to do that as a class project. And I was like, no, and don't email me anymore. Like you totally missed the point. I was like, I'll talk to you about how we arrived at that. I think that's what you are really looking for, but please don't build this farmer's market in Brooklyn. Like that's not the point. So I'm interested in that. Like the teachers being invested in creating learning experiences for students that are highly responsive to their students' lives and a sense of place. But yes, it exists. I could give it to you. I could give it to anyone. I'm much more interested in working directly with schools to develop something that's really, really for them. Yeah. Go back there and then here. Yeah. Yeah, so in case we didn't, the question was about whether or not the ideology behind, how did you phrase it? Teaching by design, whether that is transferable to all communities. I think yes. I mean, this is a great follow-up to this question. I think that there the idea of teaching by design, or whatever we want to call it, like at its core, I think is just about giving people agency in their own life, and then like the tools to make those things real. And you can call that design, you can call that social justice, you can call it participatory, whatever, but it's all kind of the same. It's like, do you have a voice, and can you do something with that voice? I think absolutely that's necessary. I think it should be a part of every community. I think it looks very different here than it might in sub-Saharan Africa, but I think that's like an essential part of the human spirit, is like wanting to have agency in your own world. Yeah. There's one over here, yeah. Yeah, good question. So I do still stay in touch with my students. That first class of students that built the farmers market, they are all graduated from college now, which is crazy. Let's see, of that class of 13, 1, 2, 3, 4 of them went into engineering. 2 of them, one is a volunteer firefighter, one is a nurse, one is actually helping to run the farmers market now. But I should also say all of those 13 students were all first generation college goers, and they all, not all of them, but the vast majority of them did end up going to college. So not specifically, I don't think I ever once said like, go to architecture school. That was never the point. But I think that they did consider like more technical careers. I don't mean technical like welding, although there was that pathway, but they were considering different kinds of majors and careers that they weren't before. Yeah. Do we find sufficient support financially and emotionally? No and no. No, and like yet here we are. So, the financial piece, just like to be a nonprofit administrator for a minute. I mean, we have funding from like a jigsaw puzzle of different categories of funders. So there's government grants. National Endowment for the Arts is fabulous. They actually are funding like some really forward-thinking, creative placemaking projects. So government grants, private grants, foundation grants, corporate sponsorships, and then individual donations. And that is like an ever-evolving whatever. And at the end of every fiscal year, it's like a big question mark again. Like, unless we have a multi-year grant, pretty much every year we're like, let's go back to zero and build it back up again. So yeah, there have definitely been projects where I thought we were going to run out of money, or we did run out of money, or those things happen. So I try to have a plan B, C, D. I think the thing that keeps us honest is that we have young people staring at us every day. And even though we talk about like, oh, the role of failure and it's important to fail and then learn from it, you can't fail when there's kids standing in front of you saying like, we're building a farmer's market. Like, you're gonna build a farmer's market come hell or high water. So you can't fail. You can't fail those kids. You also can't go around the academic school year. Like, they're gone after June 14th. So either you build it over the summer or you finish by June 14th. So the financial piece is like constantly a problem. I will say that the most sustainable sources of funding have come from organizations that are like heart and soul partners that really believe in our work and want to do this kind of work, and that we don't have to convince. I think that's like my best answer, is that I don't want to be in the business of convincing people. I've tried, it's horrible. I think the work is the thing that does the convincing, and the people who help me do that work are people who believe in it. So whether that translates to dollars or emotional support, we've had a lot of both and we've had none of both. And either way, like, you have a commitment to make it work, so. We do work primarily with kids. With adults, we have a teacher program, a teacher professional development program, which is actually called unprofessional development. So I was talking to the studio earlier that's working on redesigning schools, and I think teachers are some of the most like hardworking, incredible human beings on the planet. And I also think that many of them feel uninspired. by their own teacher training, by their schools, by their administrators. And so the work that we do with adults is primarily in an educational space. And so in other words, we don't build farmers markets with adults, but I love working with teachers who are brave enough to say, like, I tell my kids to be creative, but I don't feel creative. How do I become more creative? And then we get to help them be more creative. It's so fun. There's like a whole handful of teachers that we're running a workshop with who they all want to write a book. Like individually, they each are like, I've wanted to write a book for 30 years. And so we're like, okay, like let's go write the book. And anyway, so most of the adults that come to us are in some kind of educational space. And a lot of the conversation is actually very much the same things we ask of students to be, brave and confident and creative, like we're also asking those things of teachers. Yeah. Okay, last call. My email is emily@projecthdesign.org if anyone has questions that they don't want to voice out loud. So.
Thanks, Emily.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks.